All right, next caller, Mr. Antonio. You are live on the air. Go ahead and state your question for Rabbi.
All right, thank you. And Hanukkah, Rabbi, and of course our deepest condolences are with your father and with your family. My question actually is about Jesus. I think that the book of Mark, and this is attested to in Matthew and Luke as well, is a complete catastrophe for Orthodox Christianity, for Trinitarian Christianity. In the book of Mark, chapter 1, we are introduced to John the Baptist, who is baptizing people for the forgiveness of their sins. And lo and behold, Jesus himself is baptized under this doctrine for the forgiveness of his sins. And so my question is, if Jesus is equal to God in nature and in eternity and in authority and everything else that Trinitarian Christians say, why would God need a baptism, much less a baptism for the remission of his sins?
That's very insightful. That's how the book of Mark begins. It's the earliest gospel chronologically. It's the least embellished gospel. It's the most primitive surviving gospel. There are more primitive sources. The Q. I don't want to get complicated, but there are earlier sources than that. But right, as a gospel, it's very early. So Mark is an adoptionist theology, which means in Mark's view, there was nothing unique, extraordinary, remarkable about Jesus' conception. And the reason why people are very aghast at me for saying this is really because of Augustine, the Bishop of Hippo, who was responsible for arranging the New Testament, placing Matthew first. I could say with reasonable confidence that there is not a person on this planet that has read the book of Mark but has not yet read the book of Matthew. I want you to just absorb that. I could say with reasonable confidence that not a single one of you listening to my voice, watching me right now, has read the book of Mark and has not read the book of Matthew. Well, that's really important because Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called synoptic gospels. Synoptic are those two Greek words, synoptic with one, optic, view, syn like synonym with saying one view or the same view. So they're somewhat structured the same. But you're quite right. In that Jesus is being baptized by John the Baptist, who's baptizing people for the remission of sins, is mind-blowing altogether, because in Christian theology, that's completely impossible. In Christian theology, you can't atone without the shedding of blood. But this is, again, an earlier gospel, less developed. And in fact, the Christian Bible openly says that God can't be tempted, yet Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. These things do not work at all, but it doesn't matter. In Luke chapter 1, verse 6, we're told that the parents of John the Baptist were sinless, never sinned, blameless, kept all the commandments. In Rome, according to Romans chapter 3, according to Romans chapter everything, that's impossible, and it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It should be noted that the Gospels will go out of their way, when we, as we approach Matthew. So John the Baptist's speech, what he says to Jesus, is much more elaborate than Mark. That's not an accident. But what we find in the later Gospel, this is being addressed as like, I'm not even worthy, tie his sandals. I'm not worthy of all this. Someone greater than me. Well, where does that all come from? It comes from the implicit question that you're raising here. One other thing that's not often noted, but I think it deserves to be, is that John the Baptist was a very real person. He was the real celebrity at the time. It means we live in a time when Christianity is the largest, most influential religion in the world. If we dialed the calendar back 2,000 years, the person in the first century who was very well known, who was an acclaimed spiritual religious figure, celebrity, was John the Baptist. And that's why the Gospels are going to want to attach Jesus to John the Baptist because he's the rock star, And in fact, Luke, and Luke alone, will seek to show that it was family and that Jesus and John the Baptist were basically cousins. No one else does that. Now, I'll just take this to the other end of the spectrum. By the time we get to the book of John, the fourth of four Gospels, so this becomes a little tiresome because, as it turns out, your suspicions are quite right. It was the one who is doing the baptism, who's baptizing, who is spiritually superior to the one who's being baptized. So although John the Baptist is very prominent in the book of John, in the prologue, following the prologue in chapter 1, John never has Jesus being baptized by John the Baptist in the book of John. So you could see that each gospel really is improving upon another gospel. For those who think, there are people who think that the author of the fourth gospel may have never seen the synoptic gospels. I disagree with that completely. Well, 90% of what we find in John isn't in the synoptics. It's very clear that numerous contributing authors to the book of John were very familiar with the synoptic gospels and were correcting away very carefully. So you're quite right. There's always going to be that adjustment away from Mark. I find your approach very intriguing. What passages appear in the book of Mark, but somehow are emphasized less or disappear from the other Gospels? And is what you would expect. His family thinking he's nuts. We're not going to expect to find that in later Gospels, that there's this naked lad running away when Jesus is being seized at the end of Mark 14. Probably the weirdest passage in the New Testament, just wearing a linen cloth, and as Jesus is being arrested, this young lad dashes away and the linen cloth remains behind, and you have this young naked teenager running away. That kind of stuff is going to disappear in later Gospels and later iterations, later versions of Jesus' story. So you're right. But John the Baptist, make no mistake about it, he was the celebrity of the first century. And so when the Gospels are written in the first century, the headliner was John the Baptist. So the more we can connect Jesus with John the Baptist, you then raise Jesus' status. That's very, very important. Today, things are viewed differently. And you can see this tension is going to emerge between the baptism of John and the baptism of Jesus. That's coming up in the New Testament as well. That's very insightful. And thank you so much for your thoughtful comment. If you enjoyed this program, please like and subscribe.
אדון עולם אשר מלך בטרם כל יציר נברא עת נעשה בחפצו כל